Hey folks, I want to let you know about the sponsor of today's episode, Stream. Stream powers chat messaging activity feeds for billions of global end users across thousands of different apps. So if you want to do anything with chat or feeds, then you definitely want to take a look at Stream and their awesome SDK. They have SDKs not only for iOS, but Android as well as React, Unreal, Angular, Unity, Flutter, and more. They obsess over their API and its ease of use for its customers and provide awesome tutorials for their developer teams. So if you're looking at adding any sort of messaging to your app, Stream and Stream Chat is going to be the easiest way to do it in your iOS app. They provide all sorts of high-level UI components to connect Stream Chat API with minimal coding. If you're on iOS, they have both SDKs and Swift packages available for UIKit as well as Swift UI. Go ahead and click on the link in the show notes below to try Stream Chat for free for 30 days, or apply for your Maker account, free forever, or qualifying teams. If you're looking at adding any sort of messaging or activity feeds to your app, then Stream is definitely the way you're going to want to go. Accelerate your launch, focus on your app rather than having to worry about all sorts of problems with networking and messaging and social feeds, and grow your app. Stream is trusted by thousands of companies, more than 1 billion end users to reliably scale regardless of demand. Go ahead and click on the link in the show notes below to give Stream a try today. Thank you, Stream, for sponsoring today's episode. I'm your host, Leo Dean. Today, I'm joined by Maxim Cramer. Maxim, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me, Leo. I'm really excited about our chat.
I'll start off by letting you introduce yourself. Go ahead.
Sure thing. So, hi, everyone. So I'm Maxim. I'm based in London in the UK. And I've been in tech for, I want to say over 10 years now properly. And I started out as an iOS developer, but now I work predominantly with female founders, non-technical female founders, but really anyone from minority backgrounds that are kind of looking to start their own startup. And they've really got questions about how do you build tech? How does it work? They bring a lot of expertise from their own domains. But the tech part is new. And I love working with people and kind of showing them how do you build your first MVP, app or not. And yeah, I would say that's mostly what I get up to these days.
So it sounds like most of your projects are kind of brand new projects, brand new apps, right? What are some mistakes that developers make when they first get onto a project like this?
Yeah, I think there are a couple. I mean, there's new developers in their career, and then there's, I guess, developers who are doing these types of projects for the first time, and I can briefly touch on both. I think developers who are new to the career are very excited, which is awesome, and very focused on the technology in and of itself, right? They're like, ooh, okay, I have this one task. How can I do it the best way possible? And how can I learn as much as possible about the language and the syntax and how it works and how to write it super eloquently? Which is great because that's how we learn. So I definitely don't want to discourage that in any way, shape, or form. But I would say there is a level of practicality with work that comes as well, and it comes over time. And it's like, well, why are we actually writing this code? Is it because this is really needed? Is it a bug fix? Is it something a user needs? Something the business needs? And just having that context in the back of your mind as well, so you know how to apply your skills to the project at the right level. But at the same time, it's how we learn, and it's how this community is filled with really cool people that share like all these interesting quirks that they learn. So I wouldn't discourage it. It's just sometimes if left unchecked, it can go very much into the realm of like over engineering things, I think. Um, and the second thing, so when people are new to the projects that kind of I see like founders, first time founders working with, it's similar, but there is a huge focus on practicality. Like these folks often have very little budget, and they need to know what can be done with that budget. And so, engineers are like, yeah, I'll figure it out as I go, because, oftentimes we are writing things for the first time. Even when we have tons of experience, every project, every screen, everything is a little bit new. And oftentimes the founders are looking for more precise answers, which we can't always give. And so that's a bit of a back and forth conversation, right? There's no one in the right or wrong. It's just be prepared that the practicality part plays a huge role in the work.
Do you think there's some misunderstandings when it comes to founders as far as what exactly, I don't want to say what exactly developers do, but more like how they solve problems. What do you think are some like big misconceptions, I guess, that they have?
Oh, absolutely. I think people think it's a skill like building a house or something where it's like we use that analogy a lot actually, like building a house, both for good and bad. But after you've built like 25 bathrooms, there's this idea that you know how to build a bathroom. And I think with development, it's similar in the sense that once you've built an onboarding flow a couple times, like you kind of know how to do it and you get better at it. But at the same time, with the speed that technology changes, new APIs, SDKs that are always coming out, the nuances and differences between projects, the different APIs that you're integrating with, every project is a bit new. And we do indeed need some wiggle room to figure out, like, gosh, how does this work? And so estimates are, as we all know, estimates are
I was just
estimates.
thinking like, oh, like nobody is ever going to ask for a bathroom that if you sit on the toilet, the TV turns to a certain channel and sends you a push notification. Like software is a lot more complex. Like there's a lot of
Exactly.
interconnected pieces, whereas with building a house, like everything is separate and like yeah, plumbing is plumbing, but like at the same time, it's like it's been done for hundreds of years and it's not soft like software.
I think, especially what you said about it's been done for hundreds of years. So there's a much better understanding of what it should do. And like you say, very
Right.
weird requests like random TV channels that happen at different times
Yeah.
of the day in the bathroom is unlikely. Whereas with software, it's like, ooh, like what could I do? And there are these dreams that people conjure up and they're very hard to realize. Um, and you said as well, interconnectivity, which is really true. And I think that's the part that is completely missing because one of the first things I have to teach founders is there are different types of engineers because there are different types of development. A backend engineer is not a front end engineer, is not an iOS engineer, is not an Android engineer, is not a DevOps engineer, and et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
But a project still oftentimes needs a lot of these different components, even within just one domain, so many different components. And so that the more components, the more potential room for error and margin. And so it's not like, this is what I'm going to do. This is how I'm going to do it. Now I'm going to do it. And now I've done it, which
Right.
is what oftentimes other people think because that's how a lot of the work that they've known, how that goes.
Yeah, that's a really great point. One of the things you touched upon in your presentation at 360 iDev was the widening gap in expertise when it comes to like technology. Because it seems to me like one of the things I've noticed is, especially with the internet over the last 12 years and with the iPhone, is like the internet tended to be like, especially in the late 90s, kind of highly technical folks.
Mm-hmm.
And as the internet became more accessible, there's been more people with less technical expertise, and at the same time, apps, web browsers, web pages have become a lot more technically um, complex.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. Just that I thought that was a really interesting point in the presentation was that widening gap.
Yes. So would you like me to just kind of go over what I meant by that, or I'm
Yeah,
just
and
trying
then
to.
also just like how does that affect the way like founders now can be less technically expertise, and also they need people with more technical expertise a lot of
Yeah.
times
Yeah. Yeah.
in order to implement their ideas.
Absolutely. It's a really funny juxtaposition, isn't it? Because
Right.
at the same time, indeed, like you I think what you're trying to say is like it's less technical as well as more technical all
Right.
at the same time.
Yeah.
Exactly. Um I think that's really cool personally. Not cool in the sense that people feel a particular way about it, which I'll get to in a second, but it means that the internet is no longer just created by those who are technically minded. Everyone has a chance to contribute to it, which is why I get so excited about the work that I do. But it absolutely brings that challenge of like, okay, we're all in this space together. So how do we work together? How do we communicate with each other so that we can all work towards a common goal? At least if you're in the same team or same project, you're working towards a common goal. And that's really challenging. And what I'm still heartbroken by is that so many people who are non-technical have a real deep sense of fear and almost shame for not understanding technology. And that's what I mean with the feeling part. It's like they have all these questions and they're not sure how to ask them. I had a founder say to me, who's on my program at the moment, she's like, the first time she asked for help, she was like, she posted on this board, this women's forum. It's like, hi, I'm looking for an engineer to help me out. And someone replied and said, sure, what language? And she said, well, thinking it's international nowadays, so English would be great, thank you. Right. And that is just some of those people. And she's like, now she realized, and she's like, God, that must have been so stupid. And she had people laugh at her when she asked the difference between a front end and a back end engineer. And it's like, everyone at some point was new to learning how this works. And, the questions aren't the problem. It's just the feeling and sometimes the response by some people that makes it really difficult. And so that widening of the gap is, I think, something that with folks who have understanding in how all of this works, which is definitely us, we have to realize not everyone has had that same background, or perhaps that, let me be on the internet in the 90s and learn all of this fun stuff. At least that was what it was like for me. And so how can we bring them along?
Yeah, and one of the things that just when you were talking about that anecdote made me think is like we did an episode on learning new APIs. Just we all have to learn new stuff, even those of us who are highly technically expertise. And one of the things that I've run into when I'm learning something new is I'll assume a ton of things, and then I'll go into it with my mental model. And then I'll be like, well, why isn't this working the way I thought it did? And you realize my whole mental model is wrong. And this poor lady is like asking, like, well, or they're asking her, right, what language, and like how is she supposed to know that they were specifically talking about programming language? Like, I think there's something almost helpful about like going into something just asking open-ended questions rather than like what this person was doing is like asking what programming language like she was going to know. Like it was just yeah, there's it's unfortunate because there is a lot in the industry of like, I don't want to say like arrogance, but just like, what's the word I'm looking for? Just an assumption that, you're supposed to know everything and you're supposed to ask the right questions. And that's really unfortunate.
It is, but it's also understandable. Like the more I work in this domain, in this in between, the more I realize no one's at fault. We're all learning, we're all figuring it out. What I find really fun about talking to developers again and coming to conferences and doing the talk that I did, for example, is, the aha moment for engineers being like, yeah, I realize I'm talking to a lot of other engineers or product managers or people in the industry, right? The Silicon Valley bubble, if you will, even if you're not in California. And actually, there are people outside of that too, like that are trying to interact with this industry, if you will. And just by knowing that, suddenly you completely change perhaps how you interact with someone. And that's really all it is. It's not, some people are rude. You're never going to get rid of like people who are rude. You're never going to avoid that. Let me put it that way. But most people are just unaware at first. And then when they realize, they're like, oh, cool. Okay, well, I can help, or I can try and explain, or I can actually, show you what types of engineers there are, et cetera, et cetera. And just by drawing attention to it, I think there's so much we can do.
Yeah, and just taking like a few steps back rather than jumping into the more technical questions and asking them more about a person's goals and a person's like what their expectations are, I think are super important rather than just getting into the technical matter of things that we often do. One of the things you talked about is like developer happiness. And I know I am prone to this just as much as a lot of us. We want to build things like in a fun way, right? We want to build something that's fun. We want to learn something new. But oftentimes that gets in the way of the goal of the product. Do you want to explain that a little bit?
Sure. So the story I told in the presentation was of a founder I was working with a couple years ago, and she had worked with this engineer who at the time had built the project in using Reactive Cocoa, which was this signal-based framework just before Swift that a certain set of people really, really loved. And she then hired a couple other engineers, and this engineer went on to another project, I believe. And the new set of engineers had never used reactive Cocoa. So they were just like, what's going on? Like, we can't work out this code base. And it was really challenging for them to make the changes that were necessary. Because at this point, she'd launched the app on the App Store, it'd been featured, and she was looking to fix some bugs and like basically go to the next version, etc. And that was costing extra time and obviously for her extra money because these are all still contractors and so on. And she was not VC funded. This was all coming from her savings. And in that context, you start to realize the implications, I think, of a decision like that, even though that's probably not at all what the engineer had intended. I never spoke with them, so I can't tell their side of the story. And so, yeah, that begs the question, what's the right time for developer happiness? And I think there are a couple things to think about. One, if you are employed by, I would say, a fairly stable company, so medium-sized startup, right, like 50, 100 people plus, they have some funding, and all the way up to corporate, and you're spending a lot of time in that code base, developer happiness makes a big difference. It can make you work faster. It can make you work more efficiently. It can, in turn, actually give outsized returns on the speed of the product and the project and perhaps lead to fewer bugs and so on. I don't know the stats personally for all of that. I'm sure some people have come on the show and have told you about them, but I can see why it makes a difference. I think when you're still thinking about the 5 to 10 people team trying to build something, the product, the customer, the revenue is key. Like, there's no point optimizing something that isn't out yet or isn't generating revenue or isn't bringing returns back for the company at that size or convincing investors that this is a great bet. And it's just a different kind of project. And so I think it attracts a certain type of engineer that is perhaps a bit more, product focused or user oriented or business oriented. What I see then is with contractors or people trying to help is they take their approach from their typical job where they are either contracting on bigger projects or clients who have more funding, and they apply that same approach to this kind of project. And that's, I think, where the mismatch is happening. It's not whether developer happiness is a goal worth chasing or not. It's like, when do you apply it?
Yeah, I'd almost be like either, yeah, with an app like that, like either that person that you're bringing on the team, you need them on long term, right, to maintain the app.
Yeah.
Or like you have some sort of bridge when the reactive Cocoa person's on that helps with the new developers coming on the team. Or you just like look at building. Yeah, I don't know. That's a really tough call, right? Because you find it's hard enough to find an engineer and then be like, oh, you can't do it, use reactive Cocoa. I don't even know how you would deal with that per se. Or you just avoid like, and I think this goes to one of your other things, is like using shortcuts as opposed to building the most complex app right away, especially when you're in that MVP stage, right? And you just want to make sure that you have the audience there for the product before you invest the time and money for it, right?
Exactly. And that's also the challenge because you can't bring that person on long term because you literally can't afford them
Right.
to be there every
Right.
day. You can only
Exactly.
afford them for a couple weeks at a time to do certain features or certain bug fixes. And so
Right.
it leads to a very choppy versed version. Like most MVPs are very choppy unless you have a technical co-founder or a technical engineer that's like a founding engineer who's really there all the time. Otherwise, the code base will see many hands on them. And so some confusion and choppiness is inevitable, but I think I remember a slight deviation from this when we started using React Native at Artsy. That was really challenging for the first couple months, and I did a talk on that with Facebook, learning how to learn, and I'm sure that's kind of what you were saying about learning new API and so on. What I remember being very confusing was when I was looking at a piece of code or a line, I was like, is this a React thing? Is this a React Native thing? Is this a JavaScript thing? Or is this just a we did it in our code base thing?
Right.
And that makes it very hard to Google. And
I
so
was
the
about to
more
say
of
that,
those
yeah.
types of, the more types of frameworks like that you introduce, the more confusing it becomes for anyone reading it or jumping in. And that's why, again, you want to use shortcuts. So you're going to use a lot of libraries, but at the same time, like certain methodologies, right? Like there's no right or wrong answer. It's just these things happen at the start. And so being mindful that other people might have to jump in might just be all that's required.
a lot of what you're talking about reminds me of the stuff I've read up on like lean startup methodologies where you're just kind of
Mhm.
like building as quickly as possible to test a hypothesis as opposed to like necessarily building a product that's going to be maintained in the long term. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely.
And then go ahead. You were gonna say something.
S Yeah, I was just gonna say that's another myth I have to bust for the founders very often. I'm like, "What you're investing in right now, this code base, it's very unlikely to be around 3 years from now."
Yeah.
Like, it just and that's okay. The goal of what you're creating right now is to get you to the next step. It's like checkpoints.
Yep.
And
Exactly.
and that's just how it is. And so that as well, again, thinking about the house analogy and thinking about we know how to build this and I'm investing in this and it's now an asset and I have it. That's quite an interesting model to break for new founders because that's how they think about it and that's, as we know, not really how it works.
You want to build a tent first and see if you like it, and then okay, then you build a mobile home or whatever the next step is. Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Have you looked at have you had situations where you've just been like, you should not build an app? We need to like do something else. Like I think in the talk you talked about these like quick build app build tools, but I mean even like less appy than that, but just test an idea that there's even an audience for what you're building before you build the app.
Absolutely. To be honest, that's what I spend most of my time doing. I get a lot of Zoom calls and like, oh, can I, like jump on a call with you and like pick your brain and stuff. And so I've kind of limited that to a couple hours a week. And 9 times out of 10, I say you should not be building an app. Like this sounds like a mission-based project, or this sounds like content-based. So build that audience first. Start a newsletter, start a Instagram, like start whatever you want to do and then think about, an app, for example. And often I just have to say how much it costs to build an app, and people are like, they didn't realize that. Sometimes, though, there's that in between bit, which is one of the ones also I mentioned in the talk, which was a client who wanted a community app. Like she already has a business, she's got loads of clients, and she wanted to bring her networking skills into an app. She's always wanted her own app. There are existing platforms that do this. You just need to wrap them into an app and then you're done. Like you do not have to build another login screen, another direct messaging feature, and another forum board and upload your photo and all this. Like why are we creating the same code over and over and over again? Like just use something that exists, brand it, wrap it, and you're done. And that's what she ended up doing.
And that how did that work out, if you mind me asking?
So it's still in progress for her. She's launching it with her client base. We are just finishing it up now, so I will let you know. But she's very happy with it, and
Nice.
her quote for a initial MVP was over 70,000 US, and this was done under 10. And that most of that is like a year-long subscription to the app wrapping service. And I suggested the service because they can maintain that for her. They can support her throughout. Um, but yeah, it's much simpler.
How so we kind of talked about a little bit about taking a couple steps back when you're talking to a founder.
Mhm.
What are some ways to just help developers communicate clearly and ask the right questions?
Yeah, I think firstly, it depends on who you're talking to. I will, founder specifically, there are certain things, but I think this works with anyone, product managers, designers, because it's funny. The reason I ended up, side story again, how I ended up in all of this, I've always been known as the translator between teams, and I was always working with different stakeholders and in the room always being like, oh, well, this is the implication of what this person is saying. Like, this is what it's actually going to mean for the other side, if that makes sense. And so, this whole notion of miscommunication in tech isn't just between founders and engineers or non-techie people and engineers. It's like, I think we see this a lot within startups too. So, step one to like kind of improving communication is just what's the other person trying to achieve and what's my role in the context of helping them achieve that. And what am I trying to achieve equally, right? Because you don't want those to be completely out of whack. But say that as a team, you're building something and you obviously play a role in building that. It's like, okay, where are they trying to get and how do I fit into that? Great. Now, if there are decisions that you're making or you're seeing different outcomes, so someone's saying, we want, for example, like you said, a TV in the bathroom. You might be like, well, we could do that, but, is it really necessary? Like, you're wondering all these different things, and you're wondering about all of these potential issues. Like, for example, the risk of electricity in the bathroom. I don't know about y'all in the US. I know you have hair dryers in the bathrooms.
Right.
In
UK's
the
a bit
UK,
more strict, I've heard. Yeah.
yeah, very, very, very strict. I'm very upset. I can't straighten my hair in the bathroom, for example. So because you as the techie person understand all the implications, you just have to tell them that. And I think that's something where oftentimes you say, well, we can do that, but it would be this many days, or like if we really have to, but actually there's so much more, we have so much more room for negotiation, I think, than we sometimes think. Maybe we've been shut down a couple times when we've said, well, actually this is, problematic or something. And maybe product manager hasn't agreed in the past, but more often than not, we have room for negotiation. And so I see it as our responsibility to explain the implications of certain technical decisions in a very open conversation way and say, hey, I know you're trying to achieve this. This is what I'm seeing here. This is a potential outcome. Does that work? Or, are there other ways that you can achieve that? Like, how important is it that we achieve that in this particular manner? Like, for example, with the TV in the bathroom, what are we trying to address here? Is it boredom? Is it just that you want like a cool techie bathroom? Can we achieve that with some fun lights? Can we achieve that with some magazines, like music? Like what's the goal here? And just by asking these questions, suddenly the whole energy changes and it becomes about collective problem solving, as opposed to I'm telling you what to do. Fine, I'm going to do it, but I don't like it, or I think it's stupid, or, sometimes we can get into that energy. And I think just by asking open-ended questions, we can really shift that.
I'm just looking at the question list. Was there something in particular that you feel like we've missed yet that you want to talk about?
I think also how to support other engineers, I believe.
Yeah. So let's talk about that. Let's say you are like a CTO and you've been brought on by, a founder to help out. What can you do to like help your team communicate effectively and also be that bridge between the engineers and the founder? But in a supportive way to both the founder and the engineers, if you know what I mean.
Absolutely. Again, there's no right or wrong in this case, in the sense that it's not one versus the other. It's about bringing everyone together. And both parties should massively benefit from that, I think. There are a couple ways, I think, to support your team in terms of the more, I think sometimes engineers really love developing, like they like writing code. And so documentation is like, if I must, like all of the like meetings, if I must, but like ideally, like, let me just go to town in Xcode. And I think so firstly is like, how can we address the purpose of communication and find the right balance between over communicating and under communicating? Because I think engineers as well are very scarred by the whole like, oh, we're having meetings for meetings' sake. So if you're in between the two, like as a CTO, firstly, like ask the product team, the founder, and so on, like, what's the purpose of each meeting? Let's make sure that they are as effective as they can be. Let's make sure there's agenda, what we're trying to solve here, because we're taking people away from their computer, lo and behold. And so there needs to be a reason for that. But then also I want you to make use of them as much as possible and their knowledge in those meetings. So is there prep work? How can we actually effectively run this meeting? Now, I know this has been said a million times before. I'm not the first person saying this, but I think that is a massive help. And then also noticing kind of, again, what are people actually trying to say? Because there's oftentimes communication, what people are saying, and then what they're trying to achieve. And the more in tune you get with that, and the more you can jump in and say, hey, it sounds like actually we're trying to achieve this. So-and-so, like, someone on your team, like, I know you've worked on that piece of API. Can we talk a little bit about why that might be, a week-long project rather than a one-day project? Because it sounds to me that you're expecting this to be a really quick fix, but it might not be. Like, What do you know about that? Like just being that bridge continuously between some of these ping pong, conversations that are going back and forth. And then I think lastly, for everyone, use the common denominator of communication, which is everyday language. And, we briefly spoke about metaphors before the call. And metaphors, stories, these things really help to understand how things work. And I can talk for days about why that is. I'll pause here. But using things like that really help. And so, encouraging your team to do the same, or if they have questions as to why, having that open dialogue with them about why it might be helpful would be really great.
I've talked about this before. I don't know if I've talked about it on this podcast, but like there's the book by the Heath brothers, I believe, Made to Stick. And one of the things they talk about is like the little experiment where you tell somebody to tap a certain song, and then you see if somebody else can recognize the song that they were tapping. And of course they never can, because it's just a bunch of taps. And like, I feel like sometimes communication can be like that, where we think we're making a point, but we're we already have a bunch of assumptions that we're just not communicating as well, or we're using jargon. And I think it's really great that you point out like the power of metaphors and stories and similes and things like that to kind of give a better, like you said, using everyday words to describe something. In that sense, I think is super helpful, because they don't have the 20 years of tech experience that comes with what we do. So yeah.
Exactly. And I would say the same for them when they're trying to achieve something. The more metaphors they can use, the better, because what is so beautiful about them is you instantly get a whole bunch of properties applied to something with very little effort. So when you think of a house, you think of a structure, you think of rooms, you think of security, you think of people together, you think of safety from the elements. Like there's all of these notions that you don't even consciously think about when a house, but like they immediately apply to, if you say something else is like a house, you think safety, shelter, community, warmth, like so many other things without having to say all of those words. And that's the beauty about using analogies and so on. And when we're explaining very complicated things, that the metaphors might not hold up perfectly. But if someone can get 80% of the way there because you compared it to, I don't know, a highway of getting from A to B or whatever it is, a handshake, which is often how I talk about APIs, people are expecting a certain level of how things connect together in a protocol. Suddenly people have some sense, at least, and they can then use that to understand and think of their next question to get to the deeper issue of the problem, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I think I had one or two more questions. Was there anything else you wanted to mention before we close out?
Not necessarily.
So
Completely up to you.
Really, okay, so this is the situation that I've run into. So we've talked about how developers can be difficult to deal with at times, but there's also the case where the founder has been difficult to deal with. Oftentimes you can. So there's a few things I've run into. I think the biggest one is the founder has a lot of knowledge about what they do and what their company does, but when they start working on a technical project, there's questions that come up about how certain processes work, and you can kind of tell the founder had never thought about that, and they don't know how to like communicate that, or maybe they just don't have an answer for it. How is there anything you could do to deal with those kind of situations, I guess? Does that make sense?
It does. It does. It depends on the founder, because I will say as well, like, so one of the things I tell a lot of the founders I work with is you have to learn a certain amount of this. Like, you can't circumvent that. Like, you can't run a tech startup or try and build a tech startup and have absolutely no idea what an API is, right? You don't need to learn to program. Like, you taking a 2-week Python course isn't going to do anything. But there are certain things you need to know. And then there are the founders who indeed just don't want that. They're like, I just want to tell someone what to do, and that's it. That's all that my role is. And I would say those are not great founders to work with, because a good founder will first and foremost look at at themselves and say, what can I do to improve the situation? So if they are new to a certain process, I would hope that they would have that kind of learning mindset and say, okay, well, what do I need to know about this? Can you help me get up to speed with this? Like, how can I learn what I need to learn in order to help you do what you need to do, so we can do what we are trying to do together? If they're not in that way, like, I would try and suggest that and say, hey, okay, so how about we sit down for half an hour and I'll show you why these processes are helpful and what you need to know about them, or how you can help us help you. I think that as a starting point would be great. And if they say, listen, we don't have time for that, I'm too busy, can't you just figure it out? That's your job. I would say that's not a great person to work for.
That's
personally.
a bit of a red flag.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah.
And I think too, like, there's a misunderstanding. There's like, what is it? The things you don't know that you don't know, that I think founders need to be willing to understand. There are going to be blanks that they're going to have to fill, that they might think, like you said, like we've been saying, there's assumptions that they're making that might not be correct, especially when it's applied in a technical fashion with an app or something like that. So yeah, great point. Anything else before we close out? I think we covered it pretty well.
I think so too. And I think it's just communication is it's just a juggling thing that never ends. It's the same in our relationships. It's the same with our family. It's the same with our friends. It's the same at work. Just because it's technical doesn't change necessarily the fact that communication is tricky and it's a skill to get better at. And, sometimes the word soft skill really annoys me. We think, oh, communication, it's a soft skill, it's a nice to have, but also it's fundamental to literally every single thing we do. So, I think it's worth thinking about. I think it's worth investing in, whether that's something you choose to do personally as an engineer or whoever you are, or whether it's something you choose to do as a team for the benefit of work. It comes with you from job to job. It's never wasted. It's never a wasted investment, the way I see it. So, I would say that's just like one of the reasons I'm really excited about it. And then, of course, I apply it specifically between like tech and non-tech folk. But, in general, though, it's a great skill.
Yeah, I agree completely. I mean, I think I always interpret soft skill is not like necessarily superfluous, maybe, but like soft skill, it's hard to grasp. It's not a hard, tangible thing. It's not an equation or a piece of a function that you can just unit test. You can't just run Grammarly and expect your communication to turn out clearly. So I've always really I don't know. It's a great skill to have, probably more so than the technical stuff that you can just learn on a blog post. So that's amazing that you do that. Thank you so much, Maxine, for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. It was a real joy. And it was, as I said, I love talking about this stuff. So thanks.
Where can people find you online?
Yeah, I am at Minenia on most platforms. And that is now also my business name. So minenia.com. And if, you're in a bit of a bind, you're like, gosh, I would love to improve productivity in my team. Reach out. Would love to chat to you about that. I do teach a bunch of corporate workshops and so on design thinking and communication. So happy to chat about that anytime.
Thank you so much. People can find me on Twitter at LeoGDion. My company is Bright Digit. Take some time to like and subscribe if you're watching this on YouTube. And if you're on a podcast player, please send us a review. Let us know what we should be talking about, and we will talk to you again in a couple weeks. Bye, everyone.